Today, will childcare be an election battleground? Should the government ban laughing gas? And is it possible to abolish poverty? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner for Surrey, Lisa Townsend, Labour MP Fleur Anderson, Ellie Mayo-Hagan from the Good Law Project and The Telegraph's Deputy Comment Editor Annabel Denham. Today.
When I had my daughter who was 5, I had to quit my job because we couldn't afford childcare.
The government says it's provided billions to support families with the cost of childcare, but Labour say they failed.
Too many parents are denied the opportunity to work the jobs they'd like, to give their children the opportunities they'd like. Because again and again, they're let down by the high cost and low availability of childcare.
A review for the government stopped short of recommending a ban on laughing gas. We'll hear why this professor says a ban would be misguided. And they were excluded from last year's tournament, but should Russian tennis players be welcomed at Wimbledon this year? Let's start with that story in the final headline there and show you this story. BBC Sport. Andy Murray expects Wimbledon to allow Russian and Belarusian players. They were banned last year in the wake of the war in Ukraine, but he is saying that they should be included in this year's tournament. Should they or not, Lisa?
I think it's a very difficult question, isn't it? Particularly for those players who you are potentially excluding from it. But unfortunately, Putin's methods and his anti-West rhetoric and the propaganda he uses in Russia has meant that I think we have to play at his game. And I think that means, you know, unfortunately, we should be considering banning them.
What do you think, Fleur? I mean, these are individuals being penalised. They're not representing the Russian state in perhaps quite the same way as a football team or if you're an individual as part of an Olympic team.
Life cannot go on as normal. Putin dropped 80 missiles on Ukraine last night. I was so proud when Wimbledon banned the players last year.
Well, it was the only, pretty well one of the only tournaments to do so, and they got a lot of criticism for it.
They did. I don't think they should have been penalised. I think all of the international tennis circuit should ban these players, and we should back up our sanctions across the board, and the government should bring out guidance on this. Nothing's changed since they banned them last year. In fact, things have got worse, so they should maintain the ban.
Ellie, what do you think?
Well, after the most recent strike in Ukraine, it's clear that we need a comprehensive package of sanctions against Putin because the way that Russia is behaving is completely unacceptable. Personally, I'm not sure whether that should include sports players. I can see arguments on both sides, but I think what it really should include, and I think where the focus really should be, is on the Putin-supporting oligarchs who live in this country, who benefit from this country, and who siphon off their money into their relatives' bank accounts.
Sanctions have, of course, been introduced, but you want them to be even more extensive.
Yeah, there's been articles most recently in The Times that show that actually there's still oligarchs that are getting away with it, and I think that by cracking down on that, we can issue the strongest warning to Putin possible that we will not tolerate this.
But not more broadly sport and cultural events?
To be honest, I feel mixed about that because as much as I think that we need to take a strong position, I'm going to be honest and say that I don't enjoy tennis either, so it doesn't really affect me personally. I also feel bad for players who may have spent their whole career training for something and then may not be able to be a part of it. But obviously, the most important thing has to be taking a strong position against Putin's aggression, because I think all of us on this panel, whatever else we disagree on, we can all agree that that is completely unacceptable. I think
most people do agree on that. Annabel, what about allowing Russian and Belarusian players this year? They were fined, actually, the UK Lawn Tennis Association, for banning them last year. I mean, is Ellie Mayo right about the fact that individuals are being penalised, perhaps unfairly?
I do think that they're being penalised unfairly. It isn't clear to me why those who perhaps personally support peace and do not support the war in Ukraine and certainly are not directly involved in it, why they ought to be penalised by Wimbledon and not allowed to compete. As you say, they've spent their lives training for events like this, and I don't think that we should see this as in some ways tantamount to supporting the Kremlin. The two things are quite obviously separate, and I think that the trouble is that sporting community is getting pulled now into making a decision over what is an acceptable level of violence and what isn't. If you don't let in Russian or Belarusian players, then do we need to look globally at players from other countries and prevent them from coming and competing in Wimbledon?
Fleur?
I think that players represent their country. You can't divide the two. There's a clear dividing line between a country invading another country and saying, actually, you cannot now benefit in any way from international plaudits of being on the international circuit. But I do think it's up to the international tennis board should have said this as well, and they shouldn't be penalising Wimbledon. And we should have these sanctions should be backed up by every single means possible.
Right. Would you like to see other tournaments banning Russian and Belarusian players? Ukrainian tennis player has said it should continue certainly at Wimbledon, but would you like to see it more broadly? We
should look across all sporting events, and there should be better government guidance, I think, to make sure that it's not just down to each individual sport to have to choose, but I think we should stand solidly in support of the Ukrainian people, which we say we do in Parliament, we say we do in our communities. We've welcomed so many Ukrainians, and it's horrifying to those Ukrainians that we have in our communities to be also allowing Russians to be still competing in events like this. And the blame is not on those individual Russians, not at all. It's on Putin.
Lisa?
Yeah, and I absolutely take Annabelle's point, and Annabelle and I agree on a lot of things, but I think on this one, we know that Putin has styled himself as the strongman of Russia. We know that he uses sport as part of his propaganda for the Russian state and the anti-West propaganda. And unfortunately, in a position that we're in, particularly with, as Fleur says, you know, everyone within the international community stands together on this issue. I do think, actually, there is a special case for saying sport should just ban Russian players.
Let's talk about childcare, because it looks as if it is going to be a key battleground at the next general election. Bridget Phillipson, Labour's Shadow Education Secretary, has given a speech, a wide-ranging speech at which childcare is at the heart. Let's have a listen.
Support for childcare is at once inadequate and delivered through too many systems, complex and confused. And the cost of childcare is pricing parents out of the jobs they love when it is available at all. Childcare itself is too often not the quality our children deserve or that staff want to provide. And all of this in a funding system which makes the problems worse. Worse because the government knows how much it costs to fund their model and yet still gives providers less. The Conservatives offer parents so-called free hours, then pay providers below the going rate to deliver them.
Let's have a look at the headline in The Guardian. It's cheaper to not work. Childcare shortage in England puts strain on parents. What we didn't hear, though, Fleur, was any detail at all. There was a wide-ranging critique of the existing arrangements. But at the heart of what Labour is saying, are you going to commit significant amounts of money, or are you going to completely transform the system?
The system absolutely needs to be transformed. I think parents across the country would be cheering Bridget on when they heard that, because that's the system that they can see. It doesn't work. 15,000 childcare places have closed since these 30 free hours were brought in 2018. 5,000 in the last year alone. So childcare is both can't be found and it's unaffordable.
But what is the solution? How will you fund it? What are we talking about in terms of billions of pounds?
So we're not going to put a price on it yet. What we're saying is that this needs to be a central part of the election campaign. In fact, it's being said today because the budget's coming up. So we're throwing down a gauntlet to the Conservatives about to bring in another budget to say, what are you going to do? The system currently is in a mess. It's not working for parents. I hope that they change it and reform it before we have an election. But as soon as we have an election, we are saying to the British public, you will see a whole-scale reform of the childcare system that's not working to ensure that we can save families money, that mums can get back out to work when they want to, and that we boost learning for children as well.
Do you agree it's broken, the system?
I think the system is far too complicated, and I think that's actually where we really penalise parents. It's an incredibly complicated. It depends what child or age is, and all of that. And particularly if you've got more than one child, there's a very good chance you've got children on different schemes. I think we've got to make it much easier. We've got to sort of take that state bit out of it. We've also got a supply side problem.
Right. Well, so when you say take the state bit out of it, what do you mean?
I think just make it much, much easier and more parent-friendly, because it's not at the moment. At the moment, it's state-friendly, it's incredibly complicated, there are an awful lot of people working on it. We know that this government has consistently put more money into childcare, really championed. I mean, great work done by Andrea Leadsom and others on early years intervention. And there is more money going into it. I'm not convinced that the money is being spent as efficiently as it could, simply because we have so many different schemes.
What do you think, Ellie May, in terms of the solution? Sorry, before I come to you, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say the state set up these systems that just aren't working, so the state has to be the solution to it as well. It can't be just left to parents and to the wild west of childcare providers.
How should it be run, Ellie May? I mean, should it be the state providing vouchers, tax breaks, hours that can be used by parents across a range of childcare providers? Because parents are still left with long school holidays where they have to find some sort of care. It is too expensive, and we know from evidence that a lot of women cannot afford to go back to work.
Well, look, I feel uncomfortable getting into too much policy detail because that's really not my area of expertise. But what I will say is there is nothing better that we can invest our money in collectively through the government than raising the next generation of children. I can't think of anything better to spend money on. And, you know, I remember when I was a teenager, there were Sure Start centres up and down the country that were free for parents and that were incredible. And what we've seen over the last 12 years is that those Sure Start centres have been closed down, and the result is where we are now. You know, I have a friend, I can think of many, but I'll just say the one, who had to essentially fight for a place for her child and now has to pay £100 a day whether her child is in nursery or not, because if she doesn't pay that money, she'll lose the place, even if her child isn't there. That's absurd. It's unworkable. It restricts people's choices about what they want to do with their lives and what they want to do at work. And I think, really, this is down to the government. I think, what's the point in having a government if it doesn't help people live good lives? And providing good childcare and providing them choice is part of that.
Annabelle?
The state is largely responsible for the unholy mess in the childcare sector at the moment, so it really isn't clear to me how it can be the solution. What we've seen since the 1990s, when childcare was largely a private and charitable matter, is growing government involvement in the sector to a point where now we're spending £6 billion a year on subsidies. By some estimates, what the Labour Party are considering might double that amount, and yet you have very high out-of-pocket costs for parents. So what we need to do first is have a fundamental rethink of what childcare is there. Why does it exist? Why is the government getting involved? What is the justification for putting taxpayer funds towards it? Why is the state so keen on having children in heavily regulated childcare settings rather than at home? Why the obsession with female labour market participation? It's absolutely right that some women are being pushed out of the workforce because childcare costs are exorbitant, but there are a lot of women, surveys show, who actually want to spend more time at home with their children. So what we need to do, rather than pumping yet more money into the childcare sector, is look at ways that we can deregulate. And this doesn't mean total deregulation, removing the government altogether from the childcare sector. It just means bringing us more in line with what you have in Europe on areas like teacher-to-child ratios. And that can bring down cost and increase supply and therefore choice for women.
More in line with Europe would actually be more state intervention, which in Europe we see that women and parents have far lower percentage that they have to pay out in childcare costs altogether. The average childcare cost is 23% of a two-parent family, which is exorbitantly high, but it's not the same in other countries where they have cracked this. And that's why Labour has said, yes, we're going to wholly reform that system. We're looking at other countries. Bridget's been travelling to other countries like Australia to look at what we can learn from places where they have got it far more right for parents.
But in those areas, they have looser
I've got 4
restrictions.
kids. They have had huge amounts of different options along the way. Was it being at home, being with a childminder, being at nursery? And at the moment, this 30 free hours scheme from the government failed from 2018 when it was brought in, has been left to fail, and that needs to be wholly reformed.
You're right that the government pays a standard rate, and that means that it's below the market rate in some areas, which is why nurseries are closing, and that restricts obviously the options and accessibility, particularly for those on the lowest incomes. But when it comes to restrictions, actually the UK has the highest teacher-child ratios of any country in Western Europe. There are some countries like Denmark and Germany that have no restrictions at all, because faith is placed in nursery providers to decide how many staff to children are necessary according to the children in their care and their needs.
So alongside that, they have a wholly different maternity and paternity pay benefit scheme, so that you need to look at the system as a whole, not just little pieces of it, because that won't work.
Right, well, you've mentioned paternity pay. I mean, should there be more policies designed to encourage fathers to stay at home and perhaps given the choice that women could go back to work?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, we talk about this often as a women's debate, and it shouldn't be a women's debate because, of course, men are parents too. And I do get worried that we sort of just talk about this as a female policy issue. And there's absolutely instances we know where women are prevented from going back into work, and particularly with the cost. But we see that with men as well. There are some excellent examples of private sector organisations who are doing brilliant work around this. And I think that we should be encouraging them as well to get more involved in this policy debate, because we can learn an awful lot from the private sector around what they've done around advancing maternity and paternity.
Right. Well, I mean, should there be more state paternity pay in order to allow fathers, dads to stay at home for longer than 1 or 2 weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, coming back to this idea of government or not government, I say again that the point of a government, the reason that we vote in and elect governments is to represent us and to act in our best interests. And that means providing services like hospitals, like schools, like childcare, like fixing our roads from potholes. These are the things that we elect our governments to do, and we should expect them to do it. We shouldn't just palm it off to another part of society and say,
so
well,
no private sector involvement at all and no private sector providers in this sense?
I don't see what is so wrong with what I remember from previous years, where the government opened lots of different Sure Start centres that worked really well, that provided for children.
Well, Sure Start centres were centres that were opened in disadvantaged areas and were supposed to help families, just to explain to viewers, from probably the moment they were born, in fact, in helping mothers to toddler age. They were criticised, inevitably, that they were being accessed by families who could afford, perhaps, to pay for some of their childcare. Would you accept that?
Yes, but it doesn't mean that you can't look at that as an example of government-run childcare being possible and working. And what we've seen, actually, over the last 12 years, to me, I feel like the evidence is extremely clear. We had a system, it wasn't perfect, but it worked. And what's happened over the last 12 years is that system has been dismantled and now we're in total chaos.
Do you agree about the Sure Start? Because actually it did work for many, many families. And perhaps the state is the answer, fully providing that sort of childcare.
Certainly, I think that the state should be offering support to those on the lowest incomes. And the big problem with the subsidy at the moment and increasing those free hours is that the uptake has primarily been among the middle classes. And I am not very comfortable with the idea that we're hiking taxes on those on lowest incomes in order that we can subsidise childcare for those who would pay for it anyway. That's one of the key risks. Instead, I think what we should be doing is handing vouchers to parents, particularly targeting it to those most in need, handing them vouchers and allowing them to spend that voucher according to what best suits their needs.
Well, I mean, there was a system like that under Gordon Brown. Of course, there was a childcare voucher scheme. It was worth up to about £2,500 a year and used by more than 300,000 families. Would you be in favour on that?
Well, cutting Sure Start schemes, to go back to that, really, they showed how much Labour it does put childcare, early years care, at the forefront of its policy making, and it will do again. And there should be some universal provision. So Bridget is announcing today there should be universal breakfast clubs for all children across the country. That's what we'll do. So vouchers or different providers, they all need to be in the mix. But there need to be options for families. It needs to cost less. It needs to be more available in every local area, including those with the most disadvantaged children, which is where cutting Sure Start centres hurt the most.
I mean, is there too much pressure on women to return to work, Lisa? I mean, picking up on something Annabelle said in terms of choice.
Yeah, well, it is, and that's ultimately what it's got to come down to. It's got to come down to choice. And where women want to return to work, I think there is a duty on the state to make sure that the system is there. That doesn't mean the state is providing everything, but creating that framework. And often it means the state getting the hell out of the way, quite frankly. And if women want to return to work, then please let's do everything we can to support them do that, including make sure that men are taking their fair share. And that's not, I don't believe that's for the state to dictate either. But where women want to stay at home, then of course that should be supported as well. But
How should that be supported?
Well, Annabelle makes the really important point that actually the people that we need to protect most and what the welfare state was originally designed to do, and where the government does play a really important role, is protecting those on the lowest incomes and protecting those who are most vulnerable. That is where the state has a really, really important role to get involved. For those middle-class families and those who are earning more, I think that, that there is obviously an amount of personal responsibility that comes into that as well.
It was International Women's Day earlier this week, and yet the gender pay gap is widening. Fleur, that's because of women taking maternity leave in part. How would you address it?
Part of this issue is that women are having to cut back on their hours or leave work, and you saw that in the couple of parents that you had earlier, saying that they want to be going out to work, but they're not able to because they can't afford it. Women should be able to have those choices, and it will be a contributor to closing the gender pay gap if women can go out to get the work when they want it. And I don't think it's actually about do you work or not, because I find in my experience, having 4 children, that at times you want to work, at other times you want to be at home, and other times you want to be part-time working, job sharing. All of those options should be there to be able to get fantastic women back into the workforce who currently aren't there, and that will help our whole country's economy as well.
All right, let's talk about nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and whether or not it should be banned. BBC News story, nitrous oxide, laughing gas should not be banned, says the review. That was from the Independent Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, who've stopped short of recommending a ban of the sale and possession of nitrous oxide. It's certainly something the government had been looking into. The review was commissioned actually by the previous Home Secretary, Priti Patel. Let's talk to Professor Ian Hamilton. He's an expert on addiction and honorary professor at the University of York. Why shouldn't it be banned?
Well, I think we only have to look at the evidence of what's happened with banning other substances like cannabis. You know, nitrous oxide is second only to cannabis in terms of its popularity. And, you know, banning cannabis under the Misuse of Drugs Act hasn't reduced the number of users. In fact, what we've seen is an uptick in the number of people using cannabis. So an outright ban, particularly for a drug that I think is relatively benign, it does have problems, which we'll maybe discuss in a minute, but it is, compared to other drugs, is relatively safe. So I'm not sure the case, as the scientific advisors outlined in their report to Suella Braverman, the case isn't just there for an outright ban.
Right, who are the people who are using it? What age group are we talking about? What's the appeal?
Well, I don't think it'd be any surprise that it's predominantly young people. So whether at festivals or in city centres, up and down the country, it tends to be a drug that's attractive to younger people, partly because it's short-acting and because of, as the name would suggest, it gives you a bit of euphoria. So, and also it's relatively cheap. That's the other thing. You know, it's an affordable drug and it's very accessible.
Right, we're seeing pictures here of canisters being discarded, causing, obviously, litter, but also environmental problems. Lisa, you're a police and crime commissioner. Do you think it should be banned?
Well, I'm a favour of evidence-based policing and evidence-based legislation, particularly when it comes to drugs, because we know it's a really, really emotive subject. And whether it's cannabis that we're talking about or NOS canisters, and those canisters, actually, it's interesting, he talks about sort of city centres and festivals. You speak to any of the residents in Surrey and they'll be used to seeing them, including around the very rural parts. I absolutely welcome the council's review. I think it's really, really important that we do look into this. And there are, I slightly take issue with this idea that it's relatively benign, because we know that actually a lot of the side effects are really quite dangerous, including potentially death. Policing recently carried out some research nationally into this, and what we're seeing is an increase in road accidents, including serious and fatal accidents, where nitrous oxide has been a factor because somebody has been driving under the influence. Now, we wouldn't accept that, obviously, with alcohol or other drugs, and we shouldn't be accepting it here. But the issue is, we know that it's banned to supply. You can't legally supply it for psychedelic purposes, but you can buy it. And where I'd like to see, actually, some change is that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be a ban. I'm very reluctant to ban things until we've got proper evidence showing that that is the best way of tackling it. I don't believe it's the best way of tackling drugs when it comes to cannabis. But I really, really welcome the review, and I'm sure that the Home Secretary will look at it and take the right decision.
Yeah, and it seems that the Home Secretary would quite like to ban it. If it were banned, would police have resources to enforce it?
Well, this is why, again, I think if we can ban the buying of it, if we can make it illegal to purchase it for psychedelic purposes, then what you'll do is immediately stop that sort of demand and that supply. That will help policing. But actually, a huge issue with it, you know, take away the sort of health side effects, is it's linked to antisocial behaviour. And I think the government's absolutely right to looking at antisocial behaviour in the way it is very seriously at the moment, and we are expecting more to come out about that soon.
All right.
That's where we see it linked.
Ian, do you agree on that? Is the antisocial behaviour connected to it, and that there should be a crackdown in terms of the sale?
Yes, and as you're saying, you know, that it doesn't need to be an outright ban. I think, you know, we've not banned alcohol because people litter streets with cans, you know. So I think there's as the scientific advisors recommend, there's an educational component to this. I think the ACMD, the government advisors, are really clear on this, that no single recommendation on its own, whether it be to do with littering, whether it do to be with restricting access, is going to work on its own. Rather, it's going to be the combination of these recommendations. So, I think this generation, more than any, surely is more environmentally aware than any other. So I think, a bit of education, both in terms of littering, but also of some of the harms and effects. But we have to have a sense of proportion about this. I'm really concerned that, for information like this around a drug like nitrous oxide, the public health information and any official information needs to be credible. So it's not, I think we're in danger of scaring people into thinking this is some really dangerous substance. And I'm not trying to downplay the very small numbers, very small proportion of people who have developed problems. But I think we could do a lot by educating young people, having health warnings on canisters.
What about education or regulation, Fleur?
I think it's got to be both. So it is.
You would like to see it regulated?
Well, it is regulated already,
but
to a certain extent. I don't think it needs to be. I think it needs to be proportionate, and I can understand the council's recommendations, and they have got 7 recommendations. It's not just about a ban or not; it's about what should be done in the meantime. There was a report in 2015 which they're saying actually we need to take more action on. So I welcome this discussion because I do see these little silver canisters around, and I think who's using them? What damage is it being done? And is enough being done to protect young people who are taking them? So I think there are neurological damage that can be caused by this, as well as the littering and antisocial behaviour. But you talked about the police. There is a role for the police in coordinating action, as they are, for example, and there's a pilot project in Tower Hamlets, where they're looking at working with the shopkeepers who are selling it, with the schools and the police. So there can be a role for the police here, and that's why Labour are calling for more police to do preventative action like this.
I mean, there are social and mental consequences to taking nitrous oxide. It is used, of course, in benign purposes, as we know. In dentistry, if you're giving a birth to a child, you used to have gas and air. But for young people, alongside other things that are on offer to them, should there be a more robust, muscular role in terms of dealing with nitrous oxide? Labour said that they would be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. Does there need to be something closer to a ban?
No, I don't think so. I think we need to keep ourselves in perspective. As you said, this is something that we give to women in childbirth because we know that it's safe for newborn babies. The risk is very, very small, and I think that what risk is there can, to an extent, be mitigated by giving people guidance on how to use it safely. For me, the main concern with this drug is the environmental impact. And I don't just mean littering, I mean the fact that nitrous oxide produces emissions that heat up our atmosphere and create extreme weather. So just if you're in labour for 4 hours and you're given gas and air, that's the equivalent of driving 1,500 kilometres in a car.
Is that right?
It is right. And also, the canisters themselves are not recyclable. So when you see all of those canisters rolling around on a Sunday morning, and I've seen them too, those are actually going into a landfill somewhere. So it's not just that I would like to see, I think, I don't have any issue with the way that nitrous oxide, the role that it plays in society at the moment as a whole. What I would like to see change is I would like us to look at how we reduce the environmental impact of nitrous oxide, because we are in a climate emergency, and I think we really need to be looking at things through that lens.
Annabelle?
Well, I don't think it's a question of to ban or not to ban because it has industrial uses. I actually take real issue with the fact that hospitals are now clamping down on the use of gas and air, not on environmental grounds, but actually because they're worried about the health impact that it might have on NHS staff.
Over a long period of time?
Over a long period of time, even though there's absolutely no evidence, and the NHS
Is that
themselves
true that there's
said,
no evidence?
Well, they've said that no staff member thus far has been impacted by it, and let's not forget that hospital staff actually spend a lot of time out of the room when a woman is in labour. Women, when they're in childbirth, they often request an epidural that they're denied, and now we're telling them that they can't have gas and air either on environmental grounds or because, once again, the staff who work within the NHS are coming before the patients. Ban is not necessary as well because we already have, as we've discussed, certain restrictions on the sale and the supply and the production of nitrous oxide. We can't enforce the drug laws that we already have. Why are we looking at introducing more? And why is it that we've just found ourselves in this perpetual cycle of banning things? You know, anything that the government seems not to like, it just wants to clamp down on and ban. And I think that we really should retrench from that.
Yeah, Ian, more broadly then, does it ever really work, banning drugs?
Well, of course, in some ways it's difficult to tell because, you know, we have the Misuse of Drugs Act that has been around for 50 years, you know, but if we were to look at it in terms of has it had any meaningful impact on the number of people using drugs, and, you know, particularly for those drugs that are a bit more toxic like heroin and other opiates, then, you know, the figures speak for themselves. The UK and Scotland in particular has the highest number of overdose deaths related to drugs in Europe. So clearly, and, you know, I know it's a cliche, but it's true, you know, if we can't keep drugs out of prisons, what chance do we stand anywhere else? If I could just mention, Joe, one of the other harms that I think is really, really important that is beyond the kind of chemical harms of the drug, as it were, is the way that it's used. Now, we all know from a young age that you shouldn't put a plastic bag over your head. But unfortunately, some young people, because they're naive, they don't have anywhere they can go for information on this, are just doing that. You know, they're extinguishing the gas in an enclosed area, usually with plastic over them. And it's asphyxiation that's actually the greatest risk and the greatest problem that we're seeing with nitrous oxide. Right. Now, that's something clearly that we could, as a society and as a government, tackle and reduce the number of people who either die or are very seriously injured due to asphyxiation. Professor Ian Hamilton, thank you very much. Just on the broader point about banning drugs, what do you think? Does it ever really work when you listen to what the Professor just said?
Well, clearly what we've been doing for the last 50 years, 100 years doesn't work. And I do welcome reviews into this. And it's very, very difficult because it's a very emotive subject. But particularly when it comes to things like cannabis and like nitrous oxide, we do need to be led by the evidence that's coming from the experts. And I'm afraid on this, not necessarily politicians.
We're joined now by the Pulitzer Prize-winning sociologist and author Matthew Desmond. Hello to you. Matthew's latest book is Why Poverty in the Richest Country in the World and in other parts of the Western world continues to persist and what can be done to tackle it. You say, Matthew, that poverty persists because the rest of us benefit from it. What do you mean?
Well, poverty is a national project in America, and it's the result of exploitation in the labor market and the housing market. It's the result of an imbalanced welfare state where we give the most to families that have plenty already, and we subsidize affluence instead of alleviating poverty. And it's the result of segregation, how we create communities of affluence and build walls around those communities and hoard opportunity. And so a lot of us are implicated in this problem, which also means we're implicated in the solution.
I mean, a lot of people would rail against the idea that they knowingly and perhaps then maliciously keep poor people poor.
I disagree. I think in America, people are ready for a different conversation about poverty. Now, most Democrats and most Republicans believe that poverty is the result of unfair circumstances, not a moral failing. But what we do need to do as a country is to confront the fact that we often are the result of those unfair circumstances. I think we're ready to reach for something more as a country.
Right, and what sort of examples are you talking about if you're talking about a sort of moral mission on an individual basis?
Absolutely. I think that we can bind ourselves to this problem and become poverty abolitionists. So like other abolitionist movements, we can come to see poverty not just as a minor social problem or an inevitable part of capitalism, for example, but as an abomination, something that shouldn't be treated but cured, something that shouldn't be reduced but abolished, which means we can reach for and push for policies that...
But how can we as individuals, because there'll be governments, successive governments will have said, no, we do try and sort and solve poverty, certainly absolute poverty. Now, whether they've succeeded, of course, is debatable. But what about us as individuals? What can we do?
Well, we can push for policies that really get to the root of addressing poverty, policies that, you know, don't accommodate poverty but disrupt it. We could join social movements that are pushing for deeper labor rights or more housing justice. But also in our daily lives, we can search out how our consumption choices or in investment decisions, the places where we've chosen to live, all kind of contribute to poverty in that way as well.
OK, and how are you defining poverty?
Well, officially, poverty is not being able to afford basic necessities, but that's just a start. You know, poverty really is this exhausting piling on of problems. It's, you know, a toothache on top of the nauseating fear of eviction, on top of being cold in the winter, on top of not giving your kids enough to eat. So poverty isn't just an income level, it is really this tight knot of social maladies.
Annabelle?
Well, I'd just be interested to know what Matthew thinks the policy solutions are, if I may.
Matthew?
Well, here's one thing that we can do in America, and I think you can do it in the UK as well. So if the top 1% of income earners in America just paid the taxes they owed, not paid more taxes, just the taxes they owed, we as a country would raise an additional $175 billion every year. That's almost enough money to lift everyone out of poverty. So we have the resources and we know how to do this.
I think it's difficult because, of course, we're comparing what you have in the US, where there isn't as much of a safety net, to what we have here in the UK.
But we still have poverty here.
We do have inequality here in the UK, but we do have universal healthcare, as indeed you do on the continent, and we have a welfare state to cushion the most vulnerable in society. So I think we're not necessarily comparing like with like. Certainly I would agree with Matthew's views on things like ensuring welfare be more targeted, like ensuring that we simplify taxes, so it's more difficult for people to avoid or indeed evade it. But where I get very nervous is around ideas that are often pushed into the public domain at the moment around how we need to dismantle the current system in order to cure poverty, because everywhere that has previously been tried, in Cuba, in the Soviet Union, the list goes on, it has failed and descended into tyranny and led to the real poverty and famine and those sorts of profound issues.
Ellie?
I think most people believe that the very least that families should be able to do is to put food on the table. And something has gone profoundly wrong in a country like ours, which is one of the richest countries in the world, where so few people can do that. Even people reliant on state benefits, there was a report out recently that showed that they are £140 short every month. So people really are in dire straits at the moment. I suppose where I differ slightly with Matthew is that he talks about poverty. I prefer talking about injustice and inequality, because I think that's something that concerns us all. When we talk about poverty, I feel that we're talking about a group of people who are never quite in the room with us. Whereas injustice and equality is something that we can all join together on.
Although people understand what poverty means in their own mind.
They
people
do, but I
can't
think
afford to do the basics.
I can tell you this as someone who's interviewed a lot of people living in poverty in my life, that when you say the word poverty, no matter how poor a person is, they never think that you're talking about them. They always think you're talking about this other group. Whereas I think injustice and inequality, that speaks more to the kind of society that we all want to live in, a society that's equal and fair, where everybody has a fair shot in life and people can expect the basic things in life. And I completely agree with Matthew. And I think most people out there watching this would agree that things are not like that at the moment. Things are not working in this country, and we do need to come together and change.
Would you become a poverty abolitionist, to use Matthew's term? Labour have committed to eliminating poverty, but what does that actually mean?
I think I am a poverty abolitionist, actually, if you want to give it that name. One reason why I've become an MP is because of the poverty and inequality that I've seen in my community in London. So I think that I like the ambition of Matthew, and I really welcome the debate here to say that's what we should expect of our politicians, and that's what we should expect of policies, is that what will they do to get rid of child poverty? I don't think anyone would
Which has
argue.
risen over the past decade.
It's risen over the past years, and so that's what we should say. Are the policies working? Are children especially, because I think that's a good marker that everyone can understand, are children experiencing more poverty, less opportunity in life, less ability to get on, to contribute to our community, which overall helps us all as a country.
Right, but Matthew said in his book that it persists poverty because the rest of us benefit from it. Do you accept that we knowingly, all of us as individuals, those who have the sorts of things that many others would like, perhaps an education at university or an apprenticeship, a full-time job and a home and so on, that we are contributing and sustaining the poverty of others?
No one would like to think that because of their wealth that they have opportunity that others don't, and I think that's what they look to the state to work out and to balance, because they're not themselves going to be the ones to give up their lifestyle, but we look to the state to be able to make sure that everyone in our community at least has the basics. And when we have people who can't even afford to have enough meals in a day or are evicted, we don't. Anyone feels uncomfortable if they are seen to, but I don't think people do feel that they're benefiting or they're hoarding their wealth personally, but I think that's got to be the role of the state to address.
Doesn't it, sorry to interrupt, but doesn't it depend on who you're talking about? I mean, I would agree that the average person in this country, whether they're middle class or working class, is not intentionally hoarding wealth. But, you know, we have these sort of crazy statistics, like the 8 richest people in the world have as much wealth as the bottom 50%. Those people spend millions and millions of pounds on lobbying government in order to make sure that there are policies that suit them, and politicians listen to them. You know, so there are people, you know, it might not be you and me, but there are people, you know, in this country and in this world, the very, very rich, who are kind of you know, fixing the system for their benefit. And what we need is we need people to come together and be a sort of counterpower for that. Like in the Good Law Project, what we do is we know that ordinary people can't access the law. So what we do is we bring thousands of people together, they chip in, and we take cases that an ordinary person couldn't bring on their own. Right. And I think that's what we need to do as a society. We need
across
to come
the board.
together.
I mean, that's what Matthew was suggesting too. Should there be more collective bargaining, more union rights, better rights for the sort of cooperatives that would act as a whole rather than as an individual?
Better laws in the first place.
Where I take issue with what Matthew's talking about, I think, is this moral crusade that he wants us all to go on. I think we are comparing apples and pears, as Annabelle said, when we compare the US. And there may well be a moral deficit in the US around this. I think every one of us...
you don't think there's a moral deficit?
Don't you think you're letting Britain off the hook a little bit there? I mean, there's people who can't eat in this country.
I think every one of us around this table could come up with a couple of easy ways the US could improve on their sort of issue. I mean, first of all, as Annabelle said, welfare is a classic one. Maternity rights for women, employee rights in the US,
and here
free healthcare.
We've just been talking about childcare
absolutely.
policies that are absolutely failing.
And I think that's it. But so much of what we've talked about this afternoon has actually been around raising life chances. You know, whether it's talking about drugs and young people and getting them off them, whether it's childcare we're talking about. So much of what we're talking about is that, and that's how we do it. We collectively work together to raise people's young, chances, and that's the same in policing. You know, policing spends so much time working with those disadvantaged young people. I don't believe in Matthew's moral crusade. I don't think that's the right way, and I don't think actually it will work in this country.
Matthew, try and persuade our panel of your moral crusade, particularly Lisa.
Look, people are dying in our countries unnecessarily. Yeah. You know, the countries that have so much wealth, like the UK and the US, we can afford to put it into all this needless suffering. You know, poverty isn't just people being hard up. It's us losing scientists and poets and diplomats that are stolen from us because people's aspirations and dreams aren't realized. And what I'm calling for is something that's better for everyone. Poverty diminishes us all. So a country that shares its prosperity is a safer country. It's a happier country. It's a freer country. It's a country that I want to live in.
Annabelle?
What I take, issue with is the idea that, I agree that we need to end crony capitalism. That's absolutely a problem. But why is it the private individuals who are at fault here, rather than the government ministers and the politicians who get influenced and swayed by them to introduce regulation that erects barriers to others or just limits the room for manoeuvre of individual men and women and companies? Why is it, why are we not looking at the failings of the state here when we talk about the fact that people can't afford to feed their families? What I think the problem is that we have a government, and we've had successive governments, that are simply trying to do too much. They want to get their tentacles into every single area of our lives, and in doing so, the government spending is going up and up and up. That's limiting the amount of money that can be spent on key services that the government should provide, like we can debate healthcare, but at the moment we have an NHS. Again, we can debate education, but we have.
But we haven't quite got time.
But it has 5 missions. Exactly that, to slim down, saying what do people want to see, and one of them is barrier to opportunity.
I'm going to say thank you to Matthew. I'm going to say thank you to Matthew Desmond for joining us today. But that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of our guests. I'll be back with Politics UK tomorrow.